as an astrologer, one of the things I'm dealing with on a daily basis is what looks like great big Greek and Roman gods, Mars and Saturn and all of these planets that we've named after these mythological characters of the past. In fact, we're even named that way sometime in the past. And it's often assumed that astrology is itself all about mythology. Well, perhaps that's one way of looking at what astrology is, but it often does get me to wonder about, well, on the one hand, does mythology describe life in the first place? And on the second place, for me, is astrology a part of it? And so, what is it that astrology is doing, and what does it have to do with myth? Mythology and real life and facts are often depicted as very different things. We often assume that mythology is really just stories and fairy tales and little bits of the past in that way that maybe date from a time when people understood the world very differently and perhaps very naively. Think of those Greek gods on mountains running the human beings like we're puppets, and all of those ideas that seem rather quaint to us. But one of the ways we can understand them today, and certainly psychologists and some philosophers have understood mythology to work, is that it's not meant to be an argument between truth and fiction. It's not meant to be about that. That really a myth is a story that attempts to make some kind of sense of our human experience or of the world that which we live in, which is so strange and confusing to humans, and we forever trying to make sense out of it. So myth is the way that we make sense out of ourselves and of our relationship with the bigger world, as well as ourselves as the strange human creatures that we are. So we can read various stories about mythological characters and the stuff that happens to them and relate to it in some kind of a way. We all understand that there is a story behind the story, that mythology is a way that we transmit messages about the human experience and the way that we share our experience, perhaps so that we can benefit from the experience of other people. It's often said that myths actually guide us through the tough times. You know, those ancient stories that are essentially stories about people experiencing terrifying situations. They might be confronted by real gods and real battles and the stuff of, scary movies. For us, the anxiety-producing problems are not necessarily in the shape of actual monsters, but they are monsters to us nonetheless. And we see in those stories people dealing with anxieties and people dealing with crises, and again, we relate to them in some kind of a way without it having to be explained. So the myth doesn't have to say to you, this is what you need to understand so that this is what you should do. The myth simply presents someone in a story that makes you even instinctively and unconsciously understand what is going on, what the nature of that response is actually all about. So on the one hand, you might just see someone in a struggle who valiantly goes on despite all the odds, and it's just a simple encouragement that you can survive. If you struggle on, you will survive. And so we see other people survive. Sometimes we see how the mythological character survives and what she does, and we realize, well, it's that kind of situation. It might not be exactly the same thing. Get the knife, cut the rope, because in a mythological tale it often seems not exactly the same reality that we're experiencing. But we understand that she made the choice to go with one type of an option rather than, say, make the sacrifice and go with the other type of an option. And engaging in those stories helps us understand aspects of the human experience in ways that we don't necessarily experience exactly ourselves, but are close enough to actually give us the lesson. All of us as human beings share our experience with all of us. as human beings. And so the myth gives us the opportunity to address and understand and deal with those matters in our own inner unconscious self, and perhaps process it without it needing to be explained to us that this is exactly what the meaning of the myth is. So essentially, in some way, myth is a kind of history. In the case of psychology, as psychology developed in the late 19th century and onwards from Freud, Freud was very interested in how myths describe fundamental crises that we have. And early psychologists took those ideas and used myth to understand these core problems that might lie deep in our unconscious and create neuroses for us, problems for us. Most famously, but amongst many others, Freud looks at, say, the story of Oedipus, who kills his father and marries his mother without realizing it's his mother, and relating to how in some situations, some kinds of neuroses are related to this inner quest, this inner idea that a man has, that his father is the threat and the competition and his mother is the desired object, or whatever the case may be. And there's this underlying assumption that myth is related to problems, to pathology like that in some kind of way. So to Freud, then, the emphasis is on dealing with the core human problems and neuroses that we have to resolve in order to mature and be able to, leave the parental home and become a fully fledged, self-functioning, complete individual. So that's his process. His student and later rival and somewhat friend and rival, Carl Jung, maybe even more famously known as connecting mythology to the deep human experience of what he called the collective unconscious. And that collective unconscious is not only a wellspring of shared actual experience in history, but it's a wellspring of this shared mythology which informs us about various things in various ways. Not quite the same things that Freud said. So Freud looks at it from the point of view and says, well, we're resolving our problems through understanding myths and learning to become independent beings and getting on with life. Jung says, well, actually, much of the function of myth is after that, not to get us to that point, but after that, because ultimately it makes us take an inner journey of some kind. He says that myth relates to this inner process, not of the known world, which is this ego-centered self that I know, but to find almost the real self, the true self, that inner guiding light of a self. So Jung essentially says that once we've conquered life that way, each of us has to go on this inner quest, this inner journey, in order to discover the real self. And in so doing, we must first confront and discard the fake self, which is the problem. And the fake self is who we believe ourselves to be, that is often constructed out of neuroses or histories or problems that we've had in the world, and we now have to be able to rise above that ordinary self in order to be able to deal with them. So Jung depicts mythology as fundamentally telling a story, and the most fundamental story is of what he referred to as the hero's journey. The hero's journey resembles our own inner quest, and that is the quest to find the true self. In so doing, we have to slay the demons or the guardians, whoever they may be, in order to find the true self, who in mythologies and stories might be represented by the gold or the treasure or something like that, and importantly, to return. So in the fictional world, that's the completion of the story must obviously end in the successful return. The completion of the journey of the self must end in the completed reintegration back into this self, so that the individual becomes the whole self, where they've integrated their outer and their inner, their worldly self and their dark shadow self, which they needed to confront in that experience of the guardian or the monster, or whoever it may be, would be the monster in the actual myth itself, but would be that inner monster facing ourselves in that more or less Jungian picture. So the myth functions to take us on the journey to restore us back to ourselves, which sounds really interesting and really great and useful. Not how everyone saw it. There were other psychologists who said that, on the contrary, myth isn't about dealing with neurosis and dealing with problems that we would normally run away from like a monster, but that we've got to conquer in some way. Rather, it's not about an adjustment to neurosis. It's an adjustment to life itself. It's not dealing with a problem per se. It's showing you ways of adjusting as a healthy individual to life. So you get important, they actually call themselves archetypal psychologists, which is interesting, draws on the Jungian idea of archetypes and myths as well, which we're not going to go into in too much detail now. But, well-known figure in that world is James Hillman and other psychologists who say that when we emphasize the pathological and the therapeutic and the compensating and dealing with problems and compensating and conquering and all of those kind of things, we are contributing to an idea that there is this other authority in ourselves that Jung called the self, that actually is kind of better than us and needs to be found, and that is a Christian Western construct. So the archetypal psychologists look at this theory of myth, or this idea of how myth works, and say, really, it's very Western in this idea that there's top-down authority, that that there's a right self and a wrong self, and that the shadow needs to be conquered and reintegrated, are all elements of essentially a Western Christian tradition. And is by giving this authority to this other self, this higher self, or what Freud himself might have called the superego, it's taking on board the cultural authority that says you should do that and shouldn't do this, and this is right and wrong, and this is who you really are. Because ultimately, it's this idea of the primacy of the self is actually quite a modern idea. It's only a few hundred years old in this way, and it again places too much emphasis on the importance of the individual rather than understanding myth to be part of what actually makes us all part of the same and part of the collective. Even though Jung himself starts at the collective unconscious, he says that our integration, taking that on board in a way, is to raise the consciousness of the self, perhaps following a more spiritual path in that. But again, of course, because if it's argued that it comes from the Western spiritual tradition, where the self, because of course if it's argued that it comes from Western Christianity in Jung's thinking, then indeed it is a spiritual path, and it does resemble other spiritual paths in that effort to know and conquer the self. So it might have resemblance to the Western Christian tradition, but that's not unlike many cultures' tradition in an effort to reach the self in some way. But important criticisms nonetheless, and important to understand that we need to get past this idea of right and wrong and pathology, and in order to be able to benefit from myth, that myth is not the exclusive domain of pathology and therapy and even of spiritual enlightenment. It's not those things. So Hillman would say it is what it is, rather than calling Saturn depression and translating it into something clinical, which even astrologers do. He says, call Saturn Saturn. say that you are having a Saturn-like experience, rather than translating it and saying it's a depression. And identifying with what the God figure is meant to embody in the first place, that it's the vast complex of shared experience of what that is, that we plug into, rather than reducing it by interpreting it and making it clinical in some way. He says those God figures are legitimate parts of who we are. They're not metaphors for who we are. And so in some ways he's saying mythology is something very real. And it's an actual living part of us, which we then can draw on and learn from, not by translating it and reading deeply into it. The ashes of Cinderella, in the hearth of Cinderella, remind us of our mortality because of ashes to ashes. I kind of somehow doubt it, because how do we make that connection, and do we trust that this is some deep unconscious connection? But rather, we identify with what the mythology literally is. In this moment, I am Cinderella. And understanding the stories of Cinderella, which is, I guess, a myth that's turned into a fairy tale, would allow us then to do whatever is appropriate in the situation, for us to adjust better to life rather than cure what ails us in some way. So that is a very important shift, perhaps, in a way that we can think about it. And certainly, as an astrologer, I can relate to the idea that we can kind of take on that persona of the God and say, I am that. It's not just this similar thing to me. So, and not reduce everything to this one idea of the self that actually encompasses all these God ideas. And Hillman says, rather just think of them as all. Don't merge it into oneself. Rather think of the self as accessing all of those kind of things. And the self itself is just one part of this, what should we say, like Mount Olympus of our own, where we've got all our own gods going on that inform lots of different parts of our experience and our understanding of the world, and things that are not just about ourselves, and these archetypes beyond ourselves, which is an important way, and I think that astrology can relate to that. One of the most famous proponents of the idea of myth and the relevance of myth in our culture and in our own lives and so on is Joseph Campbell, famous for a work called The Hero's Journey, famous for a work called The Hero with a Thousand Faces, as well as many other analyses of our culture and how we express our mythology through our culture. And he's often seen as quite parallel to Jung, because he also describes a human journey as a hero's journey. But he saw it as operating on four kind of levels. So on the one hand, it's a cosmology that explains our world to us. On the second hand, it's a metaphysical explanation of ourselves, like, in other words, as souls on a journey. Thirdly, it's a sociological explanation of ourselves, or reference, so how we interact with other human beings and the society we make. And fourthly, it operates psychologically, so understanding ourselves as psychological beings, as psychological creatures. And he says, by looking at all the myths that have perpetuated and tell us our stories of ourselves, you'll find cosmology, explanation of the cosmos, metaphysics, explanation of the self, the soul, sociology of other people, and psychology of your emotional self-being. And journeying through life teaches us about all of those things, but teaches us, says Campbell, that there is no certain result of life, that it's a process of a journey. There isn't a goal. Certainty is not the goal. So he says that through the experiences of life, which make us realize that we're not this important individual, that we are on a journey that every human being has shared, we let go of some of the need for answers and control and power of individuality and all of those kind of things. It makes us much better adjusted in that way. And what he's really saying is that we have to get past this need all the time to define life as something, to say the purpose of life is this, the right and wrong of doing it is that, the end result should be this. So you need to find a purpose of life, you need to do that purpose of life, you need to get to a result where you're happy and you have everything you need. Which is it is a kind of modern, Western, post-Christian capitalist, any more terminologies I can think of, point of view that we all recognize, because it is kind of the modern psyche. We do believe that we need to find a purpose of life, and we're told all sorts of things about that. And I think perhaps our ancestors had better language to understand what that meant. And Campbell is trying to say, well, what it is to understand that it's about the living, and it's the journey is the destination. That idea of the importance of the journey rather than of the destination, he says, is what mythology is actually trying to tell us, and it's, as it were, then supports us on that journey rather than gives us a result at the end of it. But those thoughts of we contain the complete pantheon, we're on the journey, not at a result, and that we kind of need to relate to Saturn as Saturn rather than as that interpretation of Saturn that might mean depression, for example, to psychologists and even to astrologers. It does get me back to thinking about astrology in all of that. And I often think then, I know for me, I'm not what we call a mythological astrologer. I'm not an expert in any kind of mythology at all. I haven't studied the actual Greek myths or anything that I could really relate to in any way in particular. But I still think that astrology does reflect much of mythology for what mythology's purpose is there. Thousands and thousands of years ago, our ancestors started creating the constellations in a process that lasted until about 2,500 years ago, when they more or less settled on the ones that we know. And what they were really doing as they created those shapes out of the sky and created the images and the stories was not looking at what something actually looked like, as anyone who's looked at the sky knows, but they were encoding their mythologies and their stories in those patterns and shapes. And it was a way of being able to preserve the mythology mixed with history. And in other words, passing on human knowledge and experience in an encoded way, because that ensured it would be passed on. If it was written down, that gets lost. If it was digitally recorded, well, they tell us we're going to be on the internet forever, but really, who knows how long digital recordings will be around in any form, or they require electricity, who knows what could happen to that. But the stars are always there. They're always exactly the same stars. You can look at them and see what our ancestors saw. And so by knowing the names that are given, we can construct the story. By knowing the sequence of the stars, we can say this leads to that, leads to that, leads to that. And it's a passing on of a shared knowledge and a shared experience of what has happened, how we've experienced it, how we tend to experience things. And then as they added the moving planets, they gradually begin to understand how many things go through cycles, and that some parts of the sky move in a cyclical fashion. So they start adding the moving parts, the cycles, the planets themselves, into the mythologies, the constellations, and tell stories about how the stories unfold, what happens, what kind of sequences happen, what things go together. And it looks like we're just talking about planets. Those two are together, those two are not, these are telling stories. It is really a way that they actually began to understand an unfolding of nature. In the same way that mythology is an authentic expression of human knowledge and experience and record of it, so does their observation of the cycles become an authentic knowledge, a knowledge of cycles, a knowledge of how things were repeating themselves, a knowledge of how experience is shared with other human beings, that we have the same kind of experiences. And they were finding ways to encode that into the cycles that, of course, are natural cycles, that they might have thought were caused by the moving planets or gods, but are actually just those natural cycles that unfold in us just like they unfold in everyone else. And perhaps what astrology is really all about is a practical application of mythology, not in a representational way or psychological way or fictional way, but in an actual physical model that says the constructs that we share, that we put in our mythologies, unfold in this kind of way and these kind of ways over this kind of time, and pass on that knowledge, and you shall benefit from the wisdom of the human beings that have gone before you. And I think, as astrologers perhaps, that's what we're actually doing. Well, even if you don't know about astrology much or haven't had anything to do with it, but of course even if you have, hopefully that gives you some ideas of what it really is when we consult the stars and we consult the ancient wisdom that they represent and mythology represents. I'll see you next week.